everyone, and welcome to Knights of History. Alright everyone, welcome to Knights of History, and today we're going to be discussing a topic that, every knight should talk about. Castles. We're going to start with the basics. What were castles? Why were they made? We're going to start with the basics. What is a castle? In essence, it's a fortified homestead. It's a lot more than that. To understand the full concept of castles, though, we'll have to go back in time a little bit to the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, what we know about the Roman Empire is that they had a very strong, centralized military. It was a state-run military that was incredibly effective, and it led to a lot of the people that lived under Rome to feel very safe and secure because they had this military protecting them. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, and if we go to the medieval period, which is generally in between the 5th and the 15th century, is kind of generalized where we say the medieval period starts and ends, we get to this period where there's no more centralized, strong state government. Instead, we have a lot of local, small governments that have more control. And this led to different lords controlling different areas. But if you're going to have a lord, and he has control over a certain area of land and people that live under his rule, he needs some soldiers to protect himself and the land around him. Namely because things like bandits and Norsemen that when a Viking would raid and attack local people, so they need somewhere to defend themselves and somewhere to protect themselves, rather, and an area to go to keep safe. This is where castles came into play. But to backpedal a little bit, what the early castles were called were motte and bailey. What this means is that, let's start motte and bailey castles. A motte is essentially a hill, and a bailey is an area around it. But not hill or just an area around it. It was a fortified hill. It had some sort of structure on it, think of like a tower or some sort of fortified residence. That's important. And the bailey was a fortified community area. Now, both of these things had existed prior to the medieval period. What were known as ring forts, which were fortified homesteads, if you will, like a farmstead or someone lived in what's called a ring fort. And what's important there is that it's an individual home. Now, it's worth pointing out that the two forts I'm mentioning are not really the most protective forts that existed. They were usually just had some maybe palisades around or wooden walls, nothing that was like super intimidating or would really be like, alright, we can't defend against this. What I'm saying is these weren't huge stone fortresses. These were just fortified areas. The second fort is known as the hill fort. The hill fort is a fortified community, which basically means what it says. It's an area of group of people that live together in a community that was, like, once again, walled off using basic wooden walls, nothing insane, nothing like huge towering 40-meter stone walls to protect them, but they were fortified, which was the idea to give some protection to people inside. Now, the Romans actually had fortified areas for their soldiers. They would have barracks, essentially, that were large stone fortifications that could be defended and were defended and housed Roman troops. What's important there, though, is the soldiers lived there, but it wasn't really a community. It was where soldiers went to specifically. But the motte and bailey, like I said, these two separate concepts of a hill fort and a ring fort were combined into the motte and bailey castle, where there would be a bailey, the area around the hill that was fortified and is where the kind of communal area was. And the bailey, or the motte rather, is where the fortified home was, which became a tower, which later became known as the keep. An interesting point is that the bailey is actually another term that we use still for the courtyard of castles that in later periods of time. Even now, with the huge castles that we kind of imagine, the bailey is simply the courtyard outside the keep, even though originally it was the large area outside the keep where other residents would stay. So, that's what a castle is, but why, really? Like, we know, okay, they need to defend themselves, but what led to that? Why does it exist? Well, we talk about the 5th century, the 15th century, a common prior to that, and of course into that was what was known as the Viking era. Now, or Viking Age. Vikings could be their whole own video. There's a lot of stuff to talk about with Norsemen going a Viking, or not just Norsemen, people going a Viking to, not Viking, small tip. Vikings weren't a people, they were an action that people did, kind of like pirating. It's a whole different topic. We're not going to talk about it today. But, so, Viking, just messed myself up there. People who went a Viking would raid villages and attack, and there were also bandits and thieves. Because there was no strong centralized state government, these local powers needed to deal with these things to keep the people safe, which is where localized militaries would come into play. Under the Lord's castle, or the Lord's leadership, there would be the local garrison. It's important to note here that all the soldiers that were in or around this castle that fought for the Lord, they were usually supplied by the Lord. The Lord had to pay for these things, which meant that the Lord wanted to have them close at hand and readily available, which made it very convenient to have them near the castle. Hence, the Motte and Bailey and the fortified community began to grow. It's also worth mentioning that the keep itself could be fallen back into if areas got raided or the troops needed to retreat. Usually, the fortified residents had some sort of arrow slits in the side where archers could shoot out of, or even areas that were designed to basically funnel troops into certain areas. Castle design is a whole different topic in and of itself, but it's just worth mentioning that these places were designed with combat in mind. They weren't just fortified, they were made to be fought in. There were lots of little nuances you can talk about in castles where little things that help the defenders fight off attackers that got inside. So we have these castles, we have the lords, we have the garrisons inside, but one of the biggest things that castles did were act as administrative offices for the region. So with these towers and this effective defense, we now have what's called the Motte and Bailey Castle, which was a castle that was a precursor to the large stone structures we see later. These acted as defensive positions, areas for garrisons to go to, and administrative offices for the Lord. All this comes together to a localized community of soldiers and a lord and people that would live under the protection of a local keep. Thank you for watching. This has been Knights of History, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Farewell.